This is the testimony of a man whose body became the battlefield for a truth he refused to face, until reality itself broke open. A story that unfolds where hatred, identity, faith, and the human body collide in ways that defy explanation. If stories that challenge reality, expose the hidden cost of silence, and force you to look inward matter to you, subscribe now. These narratives aren't entertainment. They are mirrors. And before we begin, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from? Because this story may have happened in a small town in France. But what it reveals belongs everywhere. Let me tell you how the burning began. I used to believe that silence was strength. I believed that if I kept my head down, did my work well, paid my taxes, prayed on time, and avoided trouble, the world would eventually loosen its grip on me. That respect would arrive quietly, the way dawn does, without announcement, without conflict. I was wrong. Silence doesn't make pain disappear. It teaches pain where to hide. My name is Youssef Khalil. I am not proud of the man I was on October 15, 2025. But I will not lie about him either. If this story is going to mean anything, to me or to you, then it has to begin with a truth I spent years avoiding. I arrived in France 7 years before everything fell apart. Algeria had become a place where effort no longer equaled survival. My wife, Samira, and I came chasing stability, dignity, a future that didn't feel like it was shrinking every year. We settled in a small town south of Lyon, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happens, where history sits quietly in stone walls and people greet each other by habit, not curiosity. I worked nights as a sanitation technician at the local hospital. It was invisible work. Necessary, but unseen. I cleaned what others refused to touch. Blood. Waste. The leftovers of suffering. I told myself there was honor in that. Some days, that belief was the only thing keeping my spine straight. During the day, the town felt muted. Predictable. On Sundays, church bells rang with a confidence I didn't understand. Not anger at first, just confusion. Their certainty sounded loud to someone who had learned to pray quietly. The hospital corridors were lined with crucifixes. Small ones above doorways. Larger ones in recovery rooms. I passed them dozens of times a shift. At first, they meant nothing. Stone, wood, metal. But meaning has a way of growing when resentment feeds it. Samira and I had no children. I need to say that plainly, because everything else grows out of it. We tried. God knows we tried. Doctors ran tests, spoke in careful tones, avoided blame. But in the end, the weight settled on my chest anyway. In my culture, a man without children is a man without proof. Without continuation. Without legacy. Samira carried her grief inward. I carried mine like armor. I stopped talking about the future. I stopped imagining anything beyond survival. And slowly, quietly, I began to notice how often I felt small. Looks on the street that lingered a second too long. Conversations that paused when I entered a room. The way people asked where I was really from. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. It was constant. A low, steady erosion. And then there was the statue. It stood in the town's central square, 100-year-old figure of the Virgin Mary, pale stone against the sky. I learned later it was a war memorial. To the town, it was history, comfort, tradition. To me, it became something else. I started changing my routes to avoid it. Not because I feared it, but because every time I saw it, something tightened in my jaw. A pressure behind my eyes. I couldn't explain why. I didn't try to. Avoidance only works in large cities. In small towns, everything leads back to the center. The more I avoided the statue, the more it followed me. In my thoughts. In my sleep. In the way my hands curled into fists without permission. I told myself stories to justify the feeling. About disrespect. About symbols imposed on shared spaces. About hypocrisy. About history. But the truth was simpler and uglier. The statue didn't make me angry. It reminded me of everything I felt I lacked: peace, belonging, certainty, dignity. It stood there, serene and unbothered, while I walked past carrying a life that felt unfinished. By October 12th, the pressure inside me had reached a breaking point. I didn't sleep that night. I stood at my kitchen window, staring toward the square, my reflection floating in the glass like a stranger. I wasn't planning yet. Not consciously. But something had already decided for me. The morning of the 15th was cold, clear, ordinary in every way that matters until it doesn't. I called in sick. My first unscheduled absence in 3 years. After Samira left for work, I stood alone in the kitchen, my thoughts racing in tight circles. I replayed every slight, every silence, every moment I swallowed words to keep the peace. I filled a plastic bottle with my own urine. I need you to understand this. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel righteous. I felt hollow, focused, like a man about to cross a line because standing still had become unbearable. At 9:47 a.m., I entered the square. People were everywhere. Elderly couples on benches. A mother rocking a stroller. Life continuing, indifferent to the storm inside my chest. I walked toward the statue. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, I almost stopped. A question flickered in my mind. What are you really doing? I crushed the thought before it could grow. I unscrewed the cap, raised my arm, and poured the liquid over the face and chest of the statue. It ran down the stone in dark streaks, pooling at her feet. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The world didn't end. The sky didn't change. Birds kept singing. Then someone screamed. I turned. Faces stared. A phone lifted. My hand froze in the air, the empty bottle slipping from my fingers and clattering onto the cobblestones. I waited for something, relief, triumph, release. What I felt instead was cold, a vast, expanding emptiness. And then, the burning began. It started as a tingle in my right palm, so faint I almost ignored it. I looked down, confused. The tingle became heat. The heat became fire. Not on my skin. Inside it. It felt as if my hand had been plunged into a furnace that only I could feel. I screamed and dropped to my knees, clutching my arm to my chest as tears blurred my vision. There were no flames, no smoke, no wounds, just pain, absolute, consuming, alive. And as the crowd closed in around me, as voices blurred into noise, one thought cut through everything else with terrifying clarity. This is not stopping. Pain changes your sense of time. Minutes stretch until they feel dishonest. Seconds become heavy, physical things, pressing against your chest. By the time the ambulance doors closed and the siren began to scream above my head, I had already lost any clean separation between thought and sensation. Everything inside me was reduced to one command: make it stop. I remember gripping the edge of the stretcher with my left hand so hard my fingernails cut into my skin. I remember apologizing to the paramedic without knowing why. I remember the embarrassment rising alongside the pain, because even then, some part of me was worried about how I looked. A grown man crying, shaking, begging. They kept asking me questions. What happened? Did you touch something? Was there a chemical? I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain a fire that leaves no ash? When we reached the hospital, the place where I usually worked unseen, everything felt wrong. The lights were too bright. The air too cold. People stared at me the way they never had when I pushed my cart through the halls at night. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a problem. They cut my sleeve off, examined my hand, turned it over, pressed fingers against my palm, my wrist, my forearm. I screamed when they touched me, not because it hurt more, but because it confirmed I wasn't imagining it. And still, nothing. No redness. No swelling. No burns. One of the nurses frowned and checked the temperature of my skin again. Normal. Perfectly normal. I wanted to grab her arm and force her to feel what I felt. I wanted to say, "Put your hand inside mine. Then tell me this is normal." They gave me pain medication. Strong stuff. I heard the word morphine and felt a flicker of hope, thin but desperate. I waited for the fog, the dulling, the mercy everyone talks about. Nothing changed. If anything, the burning sharpened, as if my body resented the attempt to quiet it. They tried ice packs. The moment the cold touched my skin, I screamed so loudly I tasted blood in my mouth. The cold didn't soothe the fire, it made it roar. The nurse pulled the ice away, her face pale now. That was the first time I saw fear in their eyes. By the time Samira arrived, I was curled on my side, my right hand clutched against my chest like a wounded animal. Her face broke something inside me. She didn't yell. She didn't ask questions. She just sat down and took my left hand, her fingers trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. Doctors came and went. They spoke in careful tones, using words meant to reassure themselves more than me. Neurological tests, blood work, imaging. Everything came back clean. My body, on paper, was healthy. I wanted to tear the paper apart. Outside the room, something else was happening. I could hear it in fragments. Phones buzzing. Voices lowered. A name repeated. Mine. Someone mentioned the statue. Someone else said, video. Another voice said, media. I closed my eyes and wished I could disappear back into invisibility. I would have taken a lifetime of silence over 1 hour of this. The pain did not pause. It did not ebb. It did not negotiate. It lived in my hand like a second heart, beating heat instead of blood. Every nerve felt awake, screaming, demanding attention. I couldn't think beyond it. I couldn't pray. Every verse I tried to recall slipped away before it reached my mouth. Night came slowly. Samira stayed until visiting hours ended. When she left, she kissed my forehead and whispered that God sees everything. I wanted to believe her. I also wanted to ask why that seeing felt so cruel. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally began to drag me under. Not sleep, never sleep, but a kind of surrender. My body couldn't sustain the tension anymore. My thoughts loosened their grip. That was when the room changed. At first, it was subtle. The air felt heavier, like a pressure drop before a storm. My breathing slowed, not because the pain stopped, but because something else had entered the space of my attention. I opened my eyes. The corner of the room was empty. White wall, chair, shadows. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. My heart started racing again, but not in panic. In recognition. I don't have words for how I knew. I just did. "She's here," I whispered. The nurse at the desk didn't hear me. The hallway was quiet. I stared at the corner, my vision blurring, not from pain this time, but from something deeper. A presence. A weight. A sadness that felt old and patient. I saw her then. Not clearly. Not the way you see a person standing in front of you. More like how you remember a face from a dream that feels more real than waking life. Blue. Soft. Still. She didn't speak. And somehow that hurt more. Tears spilled down my face, not sharp and frantic like before, but heavy. Slow. Honest. My hand still burned, but for the first time since it began, it wasn't the only thing I felt. "She's not angry," I whispered to no one. "She's just sad." I didn't know who she was. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that standing there, in that quiet hospital room, with my pride stripped away and my body screaming, something inside me finally broke open. And once it did, there was no closing it again. There are pains that scream. And then there are pains that wait. The kind that settle into you like a tenant who knows you can't evict them. By the third day, I understood that what lived in my hand was no longer an emergency. It was a sentence. Mourning did not bring relief. It brought confirmation. I woke up drenched in sweat, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. For one fragile second, before memory returned, I thought it might have been a nightmare. Then I moved my fingers. The fire answered immediately. It didn't flare. It didn't surprise me anymore. It simply was. Steady. Total. As intimate as breath. Doctors came in shifts. New faces. New questions. Same silence where explanations should have been. They spoke to me gently, the way people do when they're no longer sure they're helping. They stopped promising improvement. They started documenting everything. Pain scales became a ritual. On a scale from 1 to 10? 10, I said every time. They stopped asking after a while. My hand never changed. That became the most terrifying part. No swelling. No discoloration. No fever. The skin was warm, yes, but not hot. Perfectly alive. Perfectly intact. My body looked innocent. I was not. Outside my room, the world had found me. Someone had posted the video. Of course they had. A man standing in the square. A bottle. A statue. A scream. A collapse. It spread faster than truth ever does. Faster than context. Faster than mercy. By the second day, reporters were camped outside the hospital. By the third, my name was no longer just a name, it was an argument. They debated me on screens I couldn't see. Punishment. Provocation. Mental illness. Cultural clash. Divine justice. None of them asked what it felt like to burn without fire. Samira tried to shield me from it. She turned off the television when she thought I was sleeping. She answered calls I didn't want to hear. I could see the strain in her shoulders, the way she aged in days instead of years. We barely spoke. Not because we didn't love each other, but because some truths don't fit into words when pain is this loud. By day 4, sleep became a rumor. I drifted in and out of shallow unconsciousness, never long enough to escape. My body began to fail in quieter ways. My appetite vanished. My hands shook uncontrollably. My mouth tasted like metal. The fire didn't weaken. It educated me. It taught me how quickly dignity dissolves. How fast pride becomes irrelevant. How easily a man who once believed himself disciplined can be reduced to whimpering prayers he doesn't even believe will be answered. I tried to pray. I really did. I recited verses I had known since childhood, but they felt foreign now, like words borrowed from another man's mouth. I asked for mercy. For explanation. For distraction. For sleep. What I got instead was memory. The presence returned on the 4th night. I wasn't startled this time. I almost welcomed it. The room felt different again, that same pressure, that same quiet heaviness. I didn't look away. I didn't call for anyone. I stared at the corner and let the tears come. "She's here," I whispered. She didn't speak. She never did. But something else happened. The fire responded. Not by stopping, but by tightening. By focusing. The pain seemed to draw inward, condensing, as if it were listening too. As if it were connected to whatever stood in that corner of the room. And suddenly, without warning, I understood something that terrified me. This was not happening to me. It was happening through me. The days blurred after that. Specialists arrived. Neurologists. Psychiatrists. People with expensive shoes and careful eyes. They asked about my childhood. My stress levels. My beliefs. One of them suggested trauma. Another suggested conversion disorder, then immediately corrected himself, embarrassed by the weakness of the explanation. They all agreed on one thing. This should not be possible. By day 7, the hospital began to change how it treated me. Not unkindly, but cautiously. Like someone standing near an unstable structure. They no longer tried new medications. They observed. I became a case study. And inside that room, with the fire eating my hand and the presence returning every night, something else began to surface. Truth. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind you confess in a single moment and feel clean afterward. This truth came in pieces. Sharp ones. I saw myself clearly for the first time in years. A man who mistook silence for virtue. A man who swallowed humiliation until it fermented into contempt. A man who let disappointment rot into resentment and then called it principle. I thought of the statue again, and for the first time, I stopped lying to myself about why I had done it. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about space or symbols or history. It was about power. Or rather, my lack of it. I had felt small for so long that I needed something to kneel before me, even if only for a moment. I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I could still leave a mark. The fire surged as that thought settled. I groaned and pressed my arm against my chest, rocking back and forth like a child. The presence felt closer now. Not comforting. Not accusing. Waiting. On the 10th day, the town held a vigil. I didn't see it, but I heard about it. Candles in the square. Flowers at the base of the statue. People praying. Not just Christians. Muslims. Jews. Atheists standing quietly at the edges, unsure what to call what was happening. Some prayed for my healing. Some prayed for justice. I wondered if anyone prayed for my honesty. That same day, Father Antoine Morrow came to see me. I almost refused. I didn't want a sermon. I didn't want absolution. I didn't want another person looking at me like a symbol instead of a man. But something in me, something tired and stripped bare, said yes. He didn't wear his collar. He didn't bring a Bible. He sat down slowly, like he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. He asked me how much it hurt. Not what happened. Not what I believed. Not what I deserved. How much it hurt. I told him the truth. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. I don't believe God punishes people like this, he said quietly. The fire flared. Then what is this? I snapped, gesturing weakly at my hand. I don't know, he replied. But I believe pain can become a language when we refuse to speak. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep and dangerous. He didn't ask me to convert. He didn't defend the statue. He didn't accuse me of blasphemy. He asked me if I had ever told anyone how small I felt. I laughed. A broken sound. Men don't do that. The presence pressed in. The fire tightened. Maybe that's the problem, he said gently. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me long after the door closed. Sometimes healing doesn't happen where we hide, he said. Sometimes it happens where we fell. By day 14, my body was failing. Sleep deprivation hollowed me out. My thoughts slowed. My reactions dulled. The fire remained sharp, merciless, like it was punishing my body for weakening everywhere else. The doctors discussed putting me into a medically induced coma. I almost welcomed the idea. But the presence returned that night stronger than ever. Closer. Heavier. I felt watched, not with judgment, but with expectation. And for the first time, the fire changed. It pulsed. With my heartbeat. That was when I understood what it wanted. Not silence. Not endurance. Truth. Public. Undeniable. Uncontrolled. I began to cry. Not from pain, but from fear. Because I knew what that truth would cost me. On the 20th day, I asked to leave the hospital. The doctors argued. Samira pleaded. Father Morrow closed his eyes and said nothing. I need to go back, I said. My voice barely sounded like mine anymore. To the square. The fire surged violently, as if in agreement. I didn't know what would happen there. I only knew this. If I stayed hidden, it would kill me. And if I returned, it might too. But at least it would end where it began. And for the first time since the burning started, I felt something almost like peace, not because the pain was gone, but because the running was over. I signed the papers with my left hand, and prepared to face the place where my pride first knelt to violence, so that maybe, just maybe, my soul could finally kneel to truth. The morning I left the hospital, the sky was painfully clear. No clouds. No warning. Just a pale blue silence stretching over a town that had already decided what I was. The nurses moved carefully around me, as if sudden motion might shatter something fragile. They avoided my right hand. Everyone did. Not because it looked dangerous, it didn't, but because they had learned to respect what they could not understand. I didn't sleep the night before. The fire wouldn't allow it. It had changed again in the final days. No longer wild, no longer frantic. It was focused now. Precise. Like a blade pressed against the inside of my palm, reminding me with every pulse of blood why I was still alive. Samira helped me dress. She didn't cry. That frightened me more than tears would have. Her face was calm in the way people become when they've exhausted every argument and finally accept that they can't walk this path for you. When she adjusted my coat, her fingers brushed my right wrist by accident. I screamed. She recoiled instantly, horror flashing across her face. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that none of this was. But words felt useless now. Everything that mattered had already moved beyond language. They wheeled me out through a side entrance to avoid the cameras. Even then, I could feel eyes on me. I could feel the town leaning in, waiting for the next act. I wondered how many of them expected a spectacle. How many expected me to beg? How many expected nothing at all? The drive to the square was short. Every turn felt like a tightening noose. As we approached the center of town, the fire intensified, not explosively, but insistently. It radiated up my arm, into my shoulder, my chest. My breathing grew shallow. Each inhale scraped my lungs like glass. The car stopped. Samira helped me out slowly. When my feet touched the ground, the noise hit me all at once. Not shouting. Not chaos. Silence. Hundreds of people stood in the square. Shoulder to shoulder. Old faces. Young faces. Familiar faces I had passed for years without being seen. Cameras were there too, but they felt secondary now, like insects hovering at the edge of something sacred. Father Morrow stood near the statue. He didn't gesture. He didn't announce me. He simply stepped aside. A path opened. Every step forward was an act of defiance, not against the crowd, but against the pain. My legs trembled. My vision narrowed. The fire roared now, no longer contained in my hand but spreading, demanding. This is where you chose to be seen, it seemed to say. This is where you finish it. When I reached the statue, I stopped. Up close, it looked different than it had in my memory. Smaller. Weathered. Cracked in places I had never noticed. Not powerful. Not triumphant. Just stone. The fire reached its peak. It was unbearable now. Total. There was no part of me untouched by it. My thoughts fractured. My body bent forward without permission, and I fell to my knees on the cold cobblestones. The sound that came out of me wasn't a cry. It was surrender. I pressed my forehead to the ground, my right hand clenched so tightly my nails cut into my skin. The pain screamed for release, for justification, for anything that would make it make sense. And finally, I stopped fighting it. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words felt small, insufficient. I lifted my head. My voice trembled, but it didn't break. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," I said, loud enough for the nearest faces to hear. "I came to tell the truth." The fire surged violently, like it was resisting what I was about to do. "I wasn't angry at this statue," I said. "I was angry at my life, at my body, at my silence. I hated feeling invisible. I hated feeling weak. And instead of facing that, I chose something easier. My breathing hitched. My chest tightened. I chose to humiliate what couldn't fight back." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. I blamed religion. I blamed symbols. I blamed this town. But the truth is, I couldn't stand what I saw when I looked at myself. The fire was unbearable now. My hand felt like it was dissolving from the inside. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to retreat, to protect what little pride I had left. I didn't. I wanted power, I said, and all I had was pain. I raised my right hand. The crowd inhaled sharply. It shook violently, sweat dripping from my fingers, my arm locked in agony. The fire screamed its final demand. I see it now, I said through clenched teeth. Hatred was the only way I knew how to speak. And then I let go. Not of the hand. Of the lie. I am not strong, I said. I am broken. And I did this because I didn't know how to ask to be seen. I lowered my head again. I expected the fire to consume me. Instead, it vanished. Not gradually. Not mercifully. Instantly. One moment, there was agony so intense it erased thought. The next, nothing. No heat. No pressure. No pain. I gasped and pulled my hand back, staring at it in disbelief. I flexed my fingers. Slowly. Carefully. I pressed my palm against my cheek. Full. Real. Whole. It's gone, I whispered. The words didn't feel real in my mouth. The square erupted. People cried out. Some shouted prayers. Others wept openly. I barely heard them. I was too busy staring at my hand, trying to understand how silence could feel so loud. Samira reached me first. She fell to her knees beside me, clutching my arm, sobbing. Father Morrow placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip steady, grounding. I didn't feel holy. I felt emptied. And in that emptiness, there was peace. The days that followed were chaos. Doctors examined me again and again. Scans. Tests. Interviews. Everything was normal. Perfect. As if the last 28 days had never happened inside my body. They didn't know what to call it. Neither did I. The town changed. Not overnight. Not magically. But something shifted. Conversations happened that had never happened before. People listened who had never listened. I was invited to speak, not as a symbol, but as a man who had failed publicly and survived. I declined most of it. Healing doesn't require an audience. Months later, when someone finally asked me if I believed God had punished me, I answered honestly. No, I said. I believe my body told the truth when my mouth refused to. The statue still stands in the square. So do I. And now, I want to ask you something. What is burning inside you that you refuse to name? What anger are you calling principle? What silence are you calling strength? What truth is your body carrying because your pride won't? My hand burned without fire. But that was only the symptom. The real danger was the hatred I carried quietly, convinced it made me strong. It didn't. Letting it go did. The question is not whether pain will speak. The question is how long you will wait before you listen.